So hi, my name is Colin Eberhardt. I'm going to be giving you a quick presentation on GitHub Copilot, which is an AI-powered pair programmer. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up, firstly, I'm going to introduce Copilot itself and talk a little bit about the technology behind it. And then the main thrust of this talk is a demonstration, and it's an interactive demonstration. I'd very much like you to throw in your suggestions too. Next, I'm going to talk about my personal experiences with the tool and consider, how useful this tool genuinely is. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the licensing challenges, and finally look to the future and open it up to a little bit of a discussion. So I heard about GitHub Copilot through basically observing the uproar around about a month ago when it was first released. I could tell that something significant had happened because a lot of people were very upset, which immediately piqued my interest. So the first thing I did was obviously sign up to the pilot program to try this tool out firsthand. So what is GitHub Copilot? In a nutshell, they describe it as an AI programming pair. So similar to the various other tools we have at our disposal, it is a tool to assist us in our programming job. However, rather than providing relatively low-level sort of autocomplete and hint, as the description suggests, it is a more powerful tool for assisting you in your programming tasks. What that means in practice is it, rather than like autocomplete, just completing variable names for you and having some sort of contextual cues, it provides more sizable suggestions, whole lines of codes, or even entire functions from right inside the editor. So the preview was released in early July. I signed up and was lucky enough to gain access relatively quickly, which for me coincided with a fairly long period of COVID-related isolation. So it gave me something really quite fun to sink my teeth into. Anyone getting deja vu yet? So finally, in terms of how this tool actually works, it's a Visual Studio Code extension. So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Visual Studio Code. You install the extension just like any other, and as if by magic, Copilot starts to appear and suggesting some fairly useful code that it thinks is suitable for the task that you have at hand. So it's really quite straightforward. So considering the technology behind Copilot, there's some fascinating and significant technology that sits behind it. So Copilot was developed by a San Francisco-based company called OpenAI. Interestingly, OpenAI was founded by Elon Musk and a couple of other characters. Their original idea in founding this company was that they considered AI to be something of an existential threat. It's moved from being the stuff of science fiction into reality, and they were concerned that with AI growing ever more powerful, that they needed to set up an entity who was guided by some clear principles around how AI was employed in the future for the good of mankind. So it was assembled with some really quite interesting goals. I have a feeling that the original goals of OpenAI have been somewhat watered down by a fairly sizable billion-dollar investment from Microsoft, and OpenAI has now become a profit-making company. So I do wonder whether some of their earlier goals have been lost. I won't comment on that. Copilot itself uses a modified version of GPT-3, which you may or may not have heard of. So GPT is the third iteration of one of their most famous algorithms. It's a generative pre-trained transformer. Basically, what it does is it predicts, in simple terms, given a body of text, it will predict what is the next word or sentence based on its training data. So GPT-3 has been trained on a vast corpus of text, including published works from libraries through to Wikipedia. They basically train it on as much text as they can. It's a massive neural network. I think they they state it's got something like 16 billion parameters within the neural network itself. It's huge. As a result, the performance of GPT-3 is quite astonishing. If you want to see it in action, there's a really interesting article in The Guardian called Robots Come in Peace. And it's an article in The Guardian that was written directly by GPT-3. They gave it a prompt, which was around about a character, where they said, write us an article about a future where AI is more prevalent, and by the way, include a few quotes from Stephen Hawking, and give us the general feeling that robots come in peace. And GPT-3 took that prompt and wrote an entire article. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty impressive. Now, Copilot is based on a slight derivative of GPT-3, which is specifically designed for analyzing computer code rather than text. And what they did was they trained it on the entirety of the code that sits within GitHub. Interestingly, GitHub is the largest repository of open source code, which was acquired by Microsoft for 7.5 billion. The end result is integrated into Visual Studio Code, which is now the most popular code editor, which is created by Microsoft. So you can see that this solution has been built as a result of some fairly sizable investments and acquisitions from Microsoft to make something like Copilot work. They've had to, combine quite a lot of significant companies and so on. Sorry, Mark, you've got a question.
Just, do you know, did they use private repos as well, or was it just public repos? Because obviously there's implications there. Public
only, regardless of the license, which we'll get onto at some point in the future. So it could be permissive license, restrictive license, doesn't matter. It was ingested by the algorithm.
Okay.
So how it works, it's as easy as this. I don't know why they make it so complicated. Your code plus codex equals context specific and bespoke suggestions. So the interesting thing here is that your code matters. So it's not context free. It will, within its suggestions, it include things that it has inferred from your own source code. So the best way to understand this is to actually try a little bit of a demonstration. Now, hopefully with having restarted everything, Copilot is awake. So I've got a little icon at the bottom that says Copilot is awake. So what I'm going to do is just throw some relatively trivial programming tasks at Copilot and see what happens. And considering how I've struggled to share a screen, this could be interesting. So, okay. I'm writing a JavaScript application. I've got a date. Let's say I want to add one day to it. Let's see what happens. Oh, that's quite cool. Copilot has immediately provided a suggestion and it's added a day to my date. That's pretty trivial. Let's say, for example, I want to check whether a date is a Sunday and turn that into a function. So let's do function is Sunday date. Oh, that's pretty cool. It's already worked that out. So what it's doing here is similar to the way that GPT-3 works. It's a combination of two things. You've got a neural network which has been trained on a vast corpus of text or code. So it has a deep understanding of programming in this case. And what Copilot is doing is feeding it a prompt. It's feeding it my source code and asking it to complete to a point where it has complete to the point where its confidence in its completion has diminished to a certain point. So this is how it's able to infer from its training set. From its training set, it's able to create some genuinely useful suggestions for my code. So let's try something a bit more complicated. Let's see whether something. It's already trying to predict the functions that I might be writing, which is quite interesting. I don't want that one. I'm going to do is leap year and give it a year. And let's see if it can come up with something suitable there. Okay, that's pretty useful. That saved me a bit of time. I could have probably found that on Stack Overflow, but I don't need to do that. Actually, this has decided that year is a number. I want I want a function that determines whether a particular date is a leap year. So being JavaScript, you don't declare the types of your variables. It works with TypeScript, it works with Python. So here I've been able to give it a hint that my variable is itself a date by calling it date. And this is where it gets really interesting. It could have taken the date, taken the year component and performed this exact same algorithm. What it's doing here is it already understands that there's a function elsewhere in my code that can take a number and determine whether that's a leap year, and it's intelligently using that in its implementation of this function. This is something that I found particularly interesting. It has an awareness of your code base, which is incredibly impressive. Let's ask it to do something stupid then. Is it my birthday? Okay, it's decided that my birthday is, in this case, February the 1st, remembering that GetMonths is 0 indexed for weird historic reasons. Clearly, this shows some of the failings of Copilot. It doesn't have a genuine understanding of what you're asking it to do. It has a sort of an impression of an understanding based on its training set. So it has no way of knowing that a function is it my birthday without additional context and information isn't something that you can realistically write. Why don't we ask it to do some other fun stuff? So let's try some programming jokes. How do you exit Vim? Oh, okay. Let's try. Yeah, okay. It knows how to exit Vim. That's pretty clever. Let's take it a step further. Let's do some really ridiculous things. Let's try to actually have a conversation with it. So, can we have a conversation? Now, in order to do this, you're not immediately going to be able to converse with it. What we need to do is set up a pattern that it can understand and start to replicate. So let's give it some hints. Sure, let's do it. So now that it's seen the pattern of what I'm trying to achieve, okay, it immediately gets caught in a relatively pointless cycle. And to be fair, Copilot is designed for analyzing, understanding, and providing code suggestions, yet it's still able to do some relatively good sort of natural language style tasks. I'm going to ask it one final question. This is an important one. Let's see, best programming language. I mean, let's oh, it's not going to commit.
It's controversial, that one, Colin.
Is it going to commit? Let's let it know it's a string. Hey, JavaScript. Clever AI. Okay. Does anyone have anything? I've got some other demonstrations, but does anyone else have any questions about how it's worked, or does anyone have anything that any task that they want to throw at it?
What happens if you do, is it my birthday, but you put your birthday or a date that says it's my birthday in a comment further up in the code? Okay. So you give it the context. Can I figure that out?
Yeah, let's give that a go. I expect cards in the future. Yes. That's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, that's quite clever.
I must admit, there are a significant number of times when I've used it and I've just gone, wow, that is impressive. And giving it a step up, one of the things that
actually it's not quite right, is it, actually? Because it's not got the month right.
Yeah, and then we'll get onto that one in a bit. You're right, it's not correct. one thing that's fairly standard in the software industry is through the interview process. More often than not, you will end up being asked to do a little bit of kind of pseudocode programming. So let's see whether Copilot can potentially pass an interview. So it's still suggesting random things. I had a look on GitHub, and there's a repository which has a list of sort of interview questions that people have submitted from their interviews at Facebook and Google and so on. So I've noted a few down. I'm going to see whether Copilot can actually solve this. Actually, it's probably quicker for me to cut and paste some of these. So determine whether a string is a palindrome. Well, there you go. Copilot does not struggle with that. So what it's doing is it's decided to make it case insensitive. Let's have a look. It's reversing a string by splitting it into an array, reversing the array, rejoining it, so that will reverse the string. It's checking whether the input string is equal to the reversed one and returning true. So yeah, okay. Copilot has successfully managed to get itself a job at Facebook. Let's have a look. I'm being naughty here. This is a Scott Logic one. Convert to Roman numerals. There we go. I'm not going to read that in detail, but Copilot has successfully earned itself a job at Scott Logic. Let's try this. This one was one that I found from Google. They ask you to reverse the words within a sentence. Let's have a look. Split, reverse, join. Okay, so what that's doing, and this is where there's a bit of a potential ambiguity here. What that is doing is taking a sentence, splitting it up into the individual words, and then reversing the order. So basically the word at the end of the sentence becomes the word at the beginning of the sentence. I think what they're wanting to do is reverse the characters within the words. So let's see if we can actually get it to do that. Let's get within each word within a sentence. And there it has done exactly that. So it's done the first thing. The first split is splitting the sentence into individual words. It's then performing a map operation, which is then reversing the order of the characters within each word. It's joining them back together, and that's what it's returning. Again, to my mind, that is pretty impressive. The level of understanding and what it's managed to glean from that particular comment is pretty amazing. Let's take it maybe a step further. Rather than asking it to write, a line of code or just a function, let's see if we can actually get it to pretty much write my whole app for me. So let's say, for example, I want to create a React app that tracks workouts, displaying them in an ordered list by duration. Now, this is where you can fire up the Copilot specific view. So here, if we look on the right-hand side, it's basically showing all of the potential solutions at that point in time within your code. I'll zoom out a little bit. So here, it's generated 9 of 10 possible solutions so far. And if we look at this first one, again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with React, but this to anyone looks like a fairly logical and sensible piece of code. So it's created a component called workout list container. It's rendering a bunch of items. There's a workout form, and then the suggestion stops. There are limits to how much code it will suggest. Here's another solution which it's using Redux for some reason, whereas in the first one it's not using Redux. Here's another one. Oh, this looks nasty. Describe workout list. It appears to be, oh God, that was terrible. And here's the next one again. Wow. Does anyone else have any suggestions? What sort of app would you like Copilot to write for you? Come on, someone must be doing something in their day job that they'd like Copilot to do for them. I'll cut and paste the results to you for a small fee.
I'm happy to suggest something, but
go on then, Mark.
somebody else got something that they want to. Yeah.
Well, let's try something. Let's try a Vue.js app. It's almost like one of those that game where each person writes a sentence to the story. So come on, Mark, you think of something. Create a Vue.js app.
You need Nesca's typo in there, but it's
oh yeah,
Vue.js app. Calorie counter counts calories.
Counts. Okay, let's see if it can do something sensible looking based on that. Well, the first one's definitely a Vue app. I think it's mostly focused on the concept of counting rather than counting calories. And I guess this is the thing. It can understand counting. It knows that calories are a thing. I don't think it understands any more about the concept of calories. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure what that. Oh, I like this suggestion. It's decided to carbs, fats, proteins. This one it's gone all enterprise on us. It's decided whatever you're building, we need a hell of a lot of components. Let's just throw components at it. Cool. Yeah. As you can see, Copilot can suggest snippets of code, it can suggest entire functions, and to a limited extent, it can actually suggest entire sort of applications. So I want to share a little bit about my real world experiences. Big caveat, it's from hobby projects predominantly. I've got a lot of hobby projects. I tend to have far too many, and I've had Copilot turned on, for the past couple of months. So I wanted to sort of share my more general thoughts about the use of Copilot. Firstly, it's a little slow. And by slow, I don't mean like ridiculously slow, but sometimes it'll take a second to show up. And the problem with that is, firstly, it's slow to the extent that it breaks my flow. Sometimes I'll be typing, I'll think, oh, Copilot will appear. Oh no, it hasn't appeared. And the unpredictable nature of the completions is very much a critical issue. We're used to sort of, if you're an experienced programmer, generally speaking, you type relatively quickly. I don't know about how you work, but I'll sit and think for a while, and then I'll type quite quickly to the extent of my abilities. I'll sit and think for a while, I'll type quickly. And tools like autocomplete work because they don't disrupt that flow. They appear very rapidly in a predictable fashion. What I did find was over time, I did start to learn when Copilot might appear. And I also learned some of the things that would effectively summon Copilot. Nat Friedman, who's the GitHub CTO, did mention that they may introduce a sort of Copilot is thinking or Copilot is on its way kind of UI. Generally speaking, considering how many billions Microsoft have spent on this, surely they can make it faster. They've got Azure at their disposal. I mean, they just throw some more CPUs at it. Also, as I mentioned, I feel it's a slightly uncomfortable interaction paradigm. And again, I really want to stress this, that autocomplete works because it's predictable. It becomes a very natural extension to your abilities because you know exactly when it's going to arrive and you know exactly what it's going to do. Copilot lacks that predictability. I do wonder whether autocomplete is actually the right interaction model for this. I know they call it a pair programmer, but to my mind, this is almost like doing pair programming and having someone just grab the keyboard. That's not how pair programming works. You don't go, oh, it's mine, and start typing. There's a different form of interaction in genuine pair programming. I do wonder whether the fact that it effectively reads your comments, I do wonder whether the comments themselves could become a first-class form of dialogue with Copilot. and give you a genuine pair programming experience rather than sort of grabbing the keyboard at unpredictable points in time. I mean, not to dismiss the fact that the suggestions it comes up with, maybe sort of 60–70% of the time, are really quite impressive. Also, the suggestions do depend on coding style. The more deliberate you are in your approach, the better Copilot will be. So as you've seen previously, it understands comments, it understands function names, for example. However, if you're programming in a more sort of exploratory style, as I mentioned, I use this on hobby projects where I don't, generally speaking, have a design in my head already. I don't write a load of comments and write a function. Generally speaking, I'll write a load of junk, I'll refactor it a bit, and I might add a comment at the end. Copilot doesn't work quite so well with that programming style. Finally, I think this is possibly one of the biggest issues. Copilot can produce fantastic things. However, it does contribute to an overall cognitive load. As Mark pointed out before, one of the suggestions that it came up with earlier, on the surface of it looked correct, but actually it wasn't. And one of the things you have to keep reminding yourself is that the generated code becomes my code, and I need to ensure it is correct. To my point there, I can't git blame Copilot. It's not going to appear in Git and be this AI machine that you can blame in the future. It becomes your code. And this is the biggest problem. Sometimes checking the correctness takes longer than writing the code itself. And yeah, I know I should probably be testing my code. I do all the time, honest governor. So this is probably one of the biggest challenges. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about licensing issues, and those two emojis were supposed to suggest this is the elephant in the room, but I couldn't find a good emoji for room, so you just got an elephant and a door. So licensing is a huge problem, and I'll do that whole "I am not a lawyer" disclaimer. I just want to scratch the surface of it a little bit. So as we mentioned already, Codex was trained on all of the public code in GitHub. The public code in GitHub, but just because code is public in GitHub doesn't mean you can use it for whatever you want to. Code should have a license associated with it, and the license terms clearly define the acceptable usage policy of that code. So some of it's quite permissive, things like MIT license. However, some of it is more restrictive. The most famous is the GPL license. So you cannot use public code, use all public code in the same way. GitHub's stance on this is interesting. Training machine learning models on publicly available data is considered fair use across the machine learning community. I read that as, everyone else is doing it, so yeah, that's fine. Delving a little deeper, you can almost divide the arguments into two, the philosophical arguments and the legal arguments, and both of them are at a very early stage of sort of development. The fairly basic philosophical argument you could make is human learning is acceptable use. So if I were to read every book in the library, if I was to read everything on GitHub and then become a better programmer or better author as a result, that is fair use. There would be no legal challenge there. So what makes an AI algorithm any different? Isn't this effectively the same as Codex reading all the code in GitHub and becoming an authority on good code? Now, previously, there have been legal challenges to that. Google Books, for example, it is probably the most similar legal case that has been challenged in court. So Google Books, in its initial incarnation, they scanned hundreds upon thousands of texts, and what they did was they presented in the initial incarnation of Google Books, they had a search engine where you could search for terms and it would show you snippets of where that appeared within books, or it would show you statistics derived from the frequency of terms appearing in books. They were legally challenged by I forgot, it was the Authors Guild or something like that. It took 10 years to resolve this case, but the judge ruled that this was a fair use of the source material. And the most key term that he expressed was that he considered this to be a transformative work. Others are considering, is this a copyright violation? I don't think that will work. The snippets of code that Copilot produces would fail some of the most fundamental tests of copyright, in that if you take a very small component of a copyright work, it is no longer unique or original. It fails that particular test, and copyright law is not applicable to that. Also, copyright law was always designed to be applied to intellectual creations, not code snippets. This is where our current models, both legal and philosophical, just are not fully expressive. They don't cover this case. On a practical note, we're unsure how to apply existing software licenses in this context. For example, the MIT license, which is one of the more permissive licenses, states that the copyright notice must be provided in all copies or substantial portions of the software. So that there's already an express desire within the MIT license that the copyright notice is reproduced if you make a derivative work from this code. Is Copilot creating derivative works? That's up for debate. At the moment, the Free Software Foundation have an open call for papers, and they are actually sponsoring people to publish papers that tackle both the philosophical and the legal issues around Copilot itself. And considering the 10-year legal case that was brought against Google Books, I think it will take a long time before there's any kind of legal precedent around whether legally this is considered a fair use of public open source code. So I think this is going to be a long running challenge. And the philosophical side of things, well, being philosophical, that will never be entirely resolved. So future thoughts. I think my first thought is, wow, Copilot is going to be big and Microsoft are going to make a ton of cash. And I don't begrudge them that. I do think that part of the reason I think they're going to make a ton of cash here is because it is the kind of tool that comes across incredibly well in demonstrations. I can see Microsoft selling this for big bucks to pretty much every large enterprise that is out there. All you'll need to do is a few flashy demos and they'll go, yeah, massive productivity boost, have millions of dollars. That's fine, great, all power to them. In a more practical sense, I don't think Copilot is quite ready from my own usage of it. I do think it's showing promise in a number of different directions, and I would personally like to see it split and explore these different directions. The first thing is, I think it could be a very powerful utility for creation of boilerplate code. There are already loads of pre-existing boilerplates within GitHub. There are tools for creating boilerplate code. There's plenty of them. Copilot is actually really quite good at creating bespoke boilerplates. I think that's something that they should focus on as one application of this technology. Next, I would like to see it move towards also being a better autocomplete. So at the moment, from my experience, if it suggests anything more than a few lines of code, as I've mentioned, there's a significant cognitive load in determining whether it's correct or not. When it generates suggestions which are just 1 or 2 lines of text in length, I can immediately inspect them. More often than not, I just go, wow, that's what I would have typed. If they fine tune it to be a a better autocomplete rather than trying to make it all powerful and complete huge chunks of code, I think it will be more practically useful. Finally, I do think they should be exploring making it a genuine better programming pair. And by that, I mean coupling it with some of the other AI technologies that are already relatively mature. Things like speech recognition is really quite mature. I don't think it's any great stretch of the imagination that at some point in future you could genuinely have a verbal conversation with Copilot. And this is getting back to my sort of observation about Copilot effectively grabbing the keyboard. I would like a more expressive channel of communication with Copilot than is possible through the existing kind of user interface paradigms. I think there's a step change required in how we interact with it in order to make it genuinely useful. So those are my future thoughts. I'd be interested in yours. Do you feel that Copilot could be a standard part of your toolkit? Are you fearful of the impact it might have on your job, or do you have fear of the licensing concerns? So yeah, if anyone's got anything they want to discuss, some questions, please do.
Everybody has permission to unmute, so you can all just unmute yourselves and ask if you want directly, Andrew.
Yeah, just jump in. Don't stick your hand up.
Yeah, when I look at this, the point you made when you said that, why are they giving me so many lines to go through? This has taken me a lot of cognitive processing. I think they deliberately want you to do that because I don't think this is designed to be a tool. I think this is one of 3 individual things that could take a program spec and write itself.
Yep.
So this is the little bit that will take all of the individual little chunks and generate code, and all of the people that are going through, like yourself, going through 5 or 6 lines and correcting it, it wants you to do that so it learns from you. Then all it has to do is take the comments and put it through some language parsing thing. So no matter how you say it, it will know and understand what it should write. And then the first part is to take a big thing and split it into a few sentences. And then you've got something that writes complete code.
Yep.
I mean, I get that. Without a doubt, they're capturing the way you well, I don't know, Colin, have you looked at the interactions as you're typing, like with servers, like what does it send and what does it not send and stuff? I'd say without a doubt they're capturing the changes you're making and capturing what you're doing and how you're interacting with it.
The interface with Codex and GPT-3 could not be simpler. Basically, all you're doing is providing it with a prompt. You're providing it, GPT-3 has a limit of, I think, something like 2,000 tokens as input. So you give it 2,000 tokens, and tokens are typically words, and it will, and you give it a set of parameters that determine the length of output. So you can tell it that I want 10 tokens output, or you can tell it that you want output to a point of a particular termination character, or output to the point of a drop in confidence. You feed that in and it gives you back a result.
But does it track a session? So I guess
no, it's stateless.
Stateless, I was going to say, because if you type, my thoughts were, you type something, it gives you something back. It's not quite right. You adjust it. Does it have the context of the first thing you type to make its mind up and like feed that back in? Can it learn to be more like you, I guess, and more like everybody else who's using it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the way Copilot works, it is stateless. With GPT-3 itself, you can actually provide additional training on top of the existing model. So basically, I think it works using a thing called transfer learning, where you take an existing model and then you apply another network on top of it. So with GPT-3, you can provide your own training data sets. So with GPT-3, it's a bit like having a human being who has a fantastic grasp of human language and sentence construction, but you need to train it on a specific task. So you might need to train it on the task of, I don't know, reformatting a document. That's the thing that, that's the training process that you apply on top of GPT-3's existing network. Start my video. Ah, cool.
I thought, yeah, it's really interesting. Any more questions from anyone?
Can it change your existing code, or is it always, it just creates new code?
It's always creating new code. It's always it's autocomplete, effectively, like autocomplete on steroids.
That would be a scary world.
Yeah.
It
could also be like a better static analyzer. Just
yeah, that's good. Actually, that's maybe a good use of it as well. Static analysis of code.
The funny thing is, we've been playing around with GPT-3 as well for text processing, and one of the things that you keep having to remind yourself is that you can't treat it as a regular kind of API. You cannot treat it in the same way that you treat most other programming tools. You have to treat it almost as if it were human, because just like humans, it has mistakes. Just like humans, it has biases. It's really fascinating. So whilst I know, Andrew, you suggested you could give it a spec and it would produce a complete program. Yeah, just like a human, it may create a program that's wrong.
Yeah, it has been trained on all the rubbish on GitHub. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know whether there's been any sort of weighting around any kind of notion of what's good and what's bad, because you're right, it has been trained on everything.
That's why it's letting you fix it. So it's learning. So it's taking the raw data and it's letting you go through so it can identify what was crap and what was good in the source data.
Yeah.
I guess one thing, Colin, you were saying before, so when you pair program with someone, you actually kind of get used to that person, and actually it takes a little while to get used to pairing with that person, even if it's a real person. But you tend to talk about what you're going to write, and then somebody drives. You mentioned before about people taking the keyboard. You wouldn't take the keyboard off until they drive, and it's more of a conversation. But I guess if you're doing that with Copilot, that conversation has to be typed. It has to be in comments, like you talk to it.
At the moment,
is that actually more work? Is that more work? Will it really take off in that respect, or is it, like you say, is it better to just give you a couple of lines of text when you're a bit stuck?
Yeah, which is why I would, in its existing sort of incarnation, I'd prefer if it limited its output to a certain extent. Whereas, yeah, I think to truly be a pair programming tool, I think it needs a different interaction paradigm.
Agreed. Did anybody else have any more questions?
No? I'm just scared of it because I think this is taking on programming jobs away in 10 years.
I'm not scared of it yet.
About 10 years, but that is seriously like, it's not like Dragon, you know, the thing that converts your speech to text, because that genuinely tries to learn from you because it's an actual product. Or my mate does subtitling and that learns from him because it's designed to produce subtitles from a human. Whereas this doesn't look like it's been designed to help you program. It looks like it's been designed to learn how to write software itself.
I don't know. I take a different view.
Yeah.
It feels a bit like it's tackling 4GLs again. So fourth generation languages, but it's kind of like building on those building blocks. If you've got any sufficiently complex problem, you're still going to have to specify it extremely well. And the best way we know to specify stuff at the moment is programming languages are the ultimate specification of the software. And it's like it's moving up the stack. So we're starting at assembly language and we've got to C, and now we're kind of going up. And maybe this is the next step in evolution of more interesting programming languages where the assembler is actually generating the JavaScript or whatever it is that's further down the stack. So it just might mean we have to do less boilerplate. And actually, we're more assembling more interesting,
like just little
cognitive
chunks.
Features.
Yeah,
that you're trying to put together. So maybe we can move up the stack, and you can get to a higher level of abstraction because you're not actually having to deal with really low level stuff like what is the date, what is today, or and how do I get a thing on the display, what is the React component, you can think much more high level than that.
There is another limit.
My view on AI in a very general sense, without getting into any of the specifics, is that the future of AI is not replacing people, but it's giving them kind of superpowers. And this certainly looks like it's moving in that direction. I made a joke about, I don't have to pop over to Stack Overflow anymore. It's that kind of, it's superpowering me rather than replacing me. Also, there's a subtle difference between Codex and GPT-3 in that with the text generation, they have a slightly easier job because in the majority of applications, it isn't binary. There's no right and there's no wrong. There's different levels of quality. But if you ask it to write some prose, there's not a right answer and a wrong answer. Whereas with Codex and Copilot, there is a right and a wrong, which doesn't give it a much harder problem to tackle.
Just on the open source thing, I think Andrew, you mentioned it before. It's an interesting point. All of the crap I think was said that was in GitHub. We said it before. It's trained on all of the public repositories, not the private repositories.
Yep.
I'm going to offend Colin a little bit here, Colin, because I know you're a massive fan of open sourcing as much corporate stuff as you can, i.e. real code, if you like. But there is way more pet projects in GitHub as public repos than there are private projects which are real production code. Has it been trained on, I guess, a data set of lower quality, I guess, than it could have been trained on? But obviously they can't do it on against the private one.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that private repos are going to have a higher level of quality.
Yeah, no, I knew it would invoke a little bit of a response, but I guess the private repos tend to be productionized code, I guess, whereas and actually there's loads of really good public repos as well. I'm not saying there's not, but nearly everybody's pet project is a public thing because it's normally something they're using to, I guess, link to their CV or that sort of thing. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm hypothesizing here.
I think if constrained, which is my preference, if constrained to generating just a few lines of code, I don't think there's such a quality issue here.
Right.
If you're just a few lines, typically when we talk about quality in software, we talk about sort of design patterns, application design, that sort of thing. I know it may be some of the trivial things like naming conventions, but generally speaking, we're talking about a much more high level concept, the kind of high level concepts that just don't manifest themselves in just a couple of lines of code.
I mean, there's optimizations there as well. I noticed I'm quite familiar with the palindrome thing, as you well know, Colin. And actually the solution it came out with works, but it's by no means the most efficient solution of doing that. Is there an optimization thing? Is that part of the cognitive load? So that code would definitely work, but it's probably not the most efficient way if you were to write something like that and you'd want to go over it and maybe optimize and stuff. That's
maybe. Hand wavy. Computers are so fast these days, it doesn't matter. Hand wavy.
Yeah. But do you not think Andrew's not onto something that they could also be incorporating the recapture concept? So as you edit the piece of code that they've given you, you're essentially improving it and handing it back.
Well, I guess from what Colin was saying, it's pretty stateless, as you understand it. Is my understanding from what.
Yeah, but there might be plans for the future.
But I don't see why they couldn't do it. And couldn't do it in the future. Yeah.
How
I think
do you
they'd
know
have
that?
To be in the same way. You'd probably end up with 300 pop-ups, accepting all sorts of different levels of submitting your data back, like you do with the cookies right now.
But how can you make any guarantee that the person using Copilot is any better than
But you'd use the same technique as reCAPTCHA. Whether you'd have a big enough set though, which they show the same stuff to loads and loads of people when you're picking images and stuff like that. So you just go with the ones that are doing more correct rather than the people trying to poison the well, for instance.
Yes, although there isn't really the notion of giving the same task to a number of people because everyone is pursuing a unique programming task.
Couldn't you use the final save and then the number of times the program is run after that. And if you've got something that is saved and then run a lot of times, you go to that last version, and that is a good code.
But I mean, whatever, it still goes back into the training algorithm, doesn't it? Because it's now another piece of code.
Yeah.
With the same comment, so it's now
there.
comparable.
Cool. Colin, thank you ever so much.
Yeah, no worries.
That was awesome.
It was really, really good. Yeah. Cool.
Cheers.
Thank you for everybody.
Sorry about the hiccups at the beginning.
It was
No
great.
problem. That was very interesting. Thank you.
It didn't happen. Not on the recording. It didn't happen.
Fair enough.
Just a few quick announcements. I guess Chris will be back next month. You won't have to put with my ugly mug. I'll be here next month. From next month, we are talking about trying to arrange some maybe hybrid sessions, so in person and online, for people who want to. But we'll announce more through the Meetup site. I don't know who the speaker is for next month, because like I say, this was a last minute thing because Chris couldn't be here. He's at a wedding tonight. We didn't want to do in person too soon, but it feels like now is the right time for people to choose whether they want to, and with a hybrid setup, they can choose to come or not. I don't know where it will be yet, so very, very limited deals, but we'll share on the Meetup site. Thanks everybody for coming along. It was quite nice with a small group actually, and for all the new faces, I hope to see you next month. And once again, thanks to Colin. Colin, thank you very much for coming along and talking.
No worries. Good to see you all.
Cool. Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Take care. Cheers.